This project was inspired by questions that my students asked about how and why the president's war powers grew over time. I have always assigned my presidency students to read Louis Fisher's Presidential War Power, which documents both Congress's insistence on initiating wars in the early republic and its acquiescence to presidentially led wars in the modern era. My students asked great questions about why those enormous changes took place, and all of us were unsatisfied with the answers that I could give based on the existing scholarly literature. My own curiosity led me to want to know more about how Congress managed to exert authority over war powers in the early republic, and to ask how that congressional control eroded over time. Motivated by this question, I began a complicated, decade-long project of gathering and analyzing all of the congressional references to the Commander-in-Chief Clause in published debates, from the founding to World War I. I thought that perhaps I could code the speeches for whether they favored congressional or presidential dominance of war powers, and then run regressions on those data that would help me test some basic hypotheses about how legislators understood the constitutional balance of war powers. As it turned out, the story that emerged as I read congressional speeches about the Commander-in-Chief Clause was quite nuanced, and the context of each speech was too important to lose that detail in simplistic coding schemes. I had originally intended to write a journal article, but what emerged was a book, and a long one at that. It took me deeper into U.S. history, into work on American political development, into questions about the impact of rhetoric and ideas on politics, and into the processes of constitutional interpretation than I originally anticipated. As I read congressional speeches, it quickly became clear that members of Congress talked differently about the Commander-in-Chief Clause in different contexts, that there were entirely different conversations about the president's capacity and Congress's to govern conquered territory, to discipline wayward officers, and to initiate hostile force. But there were also commonalities across those conversations and across party lines in the ways that members of Congress talked about war powers. I also realized that there were some big changes in congressional rhetoric over time, especially after the Spanish-American War and in the lead-up to World War I. In the chapters that follow, I describe the patterns that I observed when reading members of Congress's arguments about the Commander-in-Chief Clause. Members of Congress in the early republic narrowly defined the war powers of the president as Commander-in-Chief, but they also tended to support broader war powers for presidents in their own party. They defined the Commander-in-Chief Clause while repeating just a few simple stories that seemed to define the responsibilities of both Congress and the president. Then, enveloped by the nationalist rhetoric of the Spanish-American War around the turn of the 20th century, those stories began to change, and members of Congress began to argue that the Commander-in-Chief deserved their deference on questions related to war.